The need to communicate and collaborate on a global level has created a proliferation of cloud-based tools for businesses. But with new channels come new gaps for hackers and many new security blind spots. You need full threat visibility across channels with a solution that works at the speed your company does. Perception Point's multi-layered platform provides the most robust threat prevention on the market. Perception Point Advanced Collaboration Security designs for the modern enterprise. Visit securityweekly.com/perception point. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Wow, my brain is full. A lot of interviews today. It's fantastic content. If you want more of that great content, you can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Subscribe to all of the shows on our network. In addition, you can find on that page a list of curated segments from our archives. We call them episode starter packs. They are Spotify playlists that highlight some of the more recent, I don't go too far back in some of those playlists, but some of the more recent panels and interviews we've done in Security Weekly's past. So make sure you go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Oh, that was the only announcement. Oh, no, it wasn't. I got one more announcement. Don't forget to check out our library of on-demand content. All of our webcasts are archived. You can go to securityweekly.com/on-demand and visit our YouTube channel as well to find recent webcasts from Security Weekly. We got one coming up. We don't have a date for it yet. We're going to be talking about blockchain and cryptocurrency. And I'm just there along for the ride. And Tyler and Bo Bullock from the BHIS team will be, you guys are just doing amazing work on that front. So the calls I've had with you guys, I've already learned so much. So when you see that advertised, make sure you join that webcast, because whether you've got some understanding, deep understanding, or no understanding, I think it's going to be really informative. So, and we'll segue right into a story related to that. Hackers are compromising NFT Discord channels. What does that mean?
So I'm actually working on a couple of cases right now where they're just draining wallets all over the place or stealing NFTs. So what's happened, the one that's in your actual article, there's several actually going on. Some haven't made the news yet, but there's attackers in Discord channels that are ran by NFT groups, exchanges, cryptocurrency, we'll call them coins or altcoins. Mm-hmm. With inside of those Discords, someone took over one of the Me6 bots for Discord, and they were sending them links with inside of that, something along the line saying, we're having a syncing issue, or you've got an issue with your seed key, please go to this site and secure it.
What's a syncing issue?
So there are times when the block is out of sync, or the block isn't out of sync. You have an application or a smart contract or one of the validators sent up something that is not in sync with whatever tool you're using or contract you have, and that can cause an issue where you don't see the transactions, or the sync timing is off, or a smart contract didn't initiate and failed because of something went wrong in that. And so they're leveraging some of those kind of scenarios.
Is that like a timing
as well?
So like
kind of. There's some of those.
Like a smart contract is like code that runs, that interfaces with the blockchain. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, 100%. So code that runs, interfaces with the blockchain, and or does financial transactions on behalf of events, code, situations, execution of things that happen. So anything can be written into code that can be verified or validated on the blockchain. You can essentially leverage these different mechanisms in order to build out a fully validated, almost escrow of transactions and processes that happen.
So it's like
without someone messing it up.
Programmatic transaction, basically.
Correct. And it has to, because it's all cryptographically sound and pushed to the block, and it's all signed, depending on how you're doing it, that the actions are all signed and validated, that those things happen and this happens and the transaction happens and the money gets to this place, this wallet does, something. All of those things are, transparent, immutable, and available for anybody to see. So that's why there's such a big push for a lot of these smart contracts in Web 3.0. Most financials have actually moved to this.
Using Discord, phishing users to execute a smart contract that could transfer the NFT, in this case, to me, correct?
Yeah. In this case, there's a whole bunch of ways to kind of trick users into clicking a link that takes you to a website that, has you validate with your wallet and your seed credentials, like, hey, that you own this NFT. You've got to like put these things in order to validate you own it.
Yeah.
You should never, ever, 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 ever give up a seed to anybody. You should never give up your wallet address. You should have, your inbound wallet, your hot and cold wallet.
That's the proof that I own. Basically, that's the proof I own that NFT.
So that's the access to decrypt your wallet on the blockchain.
Ooh.
And that's the verification. That's the private key that verifies that you own whatever assets are within inside of that wallet. So that could actually be multiple wallets.
Right. Could be cryptocurrency. Could be NFTs. Right.
Yep. It could be access to multiple smart contracts or the inheritance of those contracts.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, that's it's gotten pretty bad. There's a bunch of people losing a lot of money right now through these, that's social engineering at its finest. Not even good social engineering. This one actually was more believable because they compromised the Discord server and took over the Me bots, the Me6 or MEE6, however you pronounce it. Those bots were compromised, so it was essentially looking like it was coming from the exchange or the NFT group that was running the Discord server.
Oh, so the exchange or the NFT group would have bots that allow you to interact with.
Yeah, like when you look at your level on our Discord or you type one of the commands, it sends a link or we're going live. That's a bot. It's coming from us. It looks like it's from us. So they took over the Discord server and built a bot and doing actions with it to do social engineering.
So make sure you have 2FA for your Discord admins.
Yeah, that, and make sure it's patched, and make sure that you're not adding bots and running code from places that are not verified.
Yeah, like plugins for WordPress or whatever. Right?
Just same thing, man. Yep.
It's crazy. It's crazy how Discord started as a platform for gamers, right? And I think
now it's a business.
It's a business, right? So technology companies adopt that, cybersecurity. Like we see a lot of that with Twitch and Discord that were really tuned for gamers, but now are really seeing much wider spread adoption.
Yeah.
I was astonished how much Twitch streamers, YouTube streamers make that are doing these kind of video game style. I've talked about it. I think on a break or what. But I love the podcast My First Million. I forget who the guys are that run that. They're like serial entrepreneurs, and they'll hit on every different market segment and how to be like an entrepreneur or start a business and evaluate business models in like every different sector. Like, it doesn't even have to be technology. Like, they were talking about Naked and Afraid. You ever watch that show? And like someone had a business idea that was like, let's get 2 naked people and drop them in the woods for 60 days. Like, that was a business idea, dude, right? But they'll also talk about, then they'll switch right to like Twitch streamers, right? So it's like a real journey and a mind trip. But they were talking about how much money these people make, like basically playing video games and streaming it.
I don't like to think about it. Like, you think about some of the super smart people we deal with on the show, and like how many decades it's taken them to learn and do and get to the point of do what they do. Some of them make pretty good money. Some of them make all right money. None of them make the money that these people that are not skilled make on a single YouTube video or a Twitch stream. Like, I get it, and then I don't get like
the high end of a Twitch streamer on video games can be a $25 million a year company.
Yep. Yeah, and again, we promote this by letting our kids watch whatever they want. The people promote it. The gaming.
Dude, crazy thing. They're talking about I don't know, it's a YouTube channel, I think, that's like some dude in Indiana that has a ton of land, and it just hacks like trucks and tractors and stuff together. And my son that's like really into all that kind of stuff is like, oh yeah, I know that. He's listening to the podcast with me. He's like, yeah, I know that channel. It's like, I watch that channel all the time. And like, as they get more money, they do more like I don't want to say ridiculous is the wrong word, because it's a dude. You're making $25 million a year. Ridiculous is almost the wrong word, right? But
building a bunker out of hay bales and a tube that goes down to something that you put a refrigerator in and you make lights in it and game down.
What if I take a 50 cal and I see if it can go through a car door? And what if I take thicker steel and I see how far that it can get? And like, they're doing these like hacker experiments, right? But It's a multi-million-dollar a year business that they're running. It's crazy.
Yeah, I'm not impressed, as you can tell.
I mean, you don't want to be
entrepreneurs.
You don't want to be
multi-billion-dollar business and risk it on sending rockets into space.
You don't want to be impressed, but you're impressed, dude. Like you're
I'm impressed at the business prowess that they've made for a personal brand that's making them a lot of money. I'm not impressed with their intelligence that they require to get to that point.
What I thought was interesting being a podcast
or the content they make.
But being a podcast creator, I'm like, those businesses, they talked about it. So the guys that run My First Million are like, I've had a business and I've gone to these YouTube creators or Twitch streamers and I want to advertise with them to promote their own business. And they're like, they're amazed that like they say no to like 90% of the inbound. And they're like, well, who's your PR firm? And they're like, no, there's no PR firm. Like we make $10 to $25 million a year just going through our inbox and picking the 5 to 10% of like, hey, Red Bull, you reached out to us. Like, we'll do a contract with you. That's amazing. That's talk about hacking business. That's really cool.
It is really cool from that standpoint. But
like
then you look at the fact that
these people don't work, right? I think that's the
they work.
That's
hard.
the reason like why a lot of us are like, oh, like you're just an idiot on YouTube, right? That's not the case. Some of these streamers are working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week streaming. They're working hard. They're working hard. You know what? Your $25 million a year business, you're working hard, and I respect that, right?
Yep.
Anyway, it was a somewhat, kind of segue off of that. It was something that I saw, but
some really Tesla, cool. Like Tesla might sponsor some of them. We could talk about the Tesla Bluetooth Low Energy hacks.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen this attack before, though, right? Like whether it's a key fob or whether it's Bluetooth, the ability to remotely unlock a car or start it is a thing, and that's going to persist for a while, right?
Yeah. This one's interesting though because it's geographically able to traverse whatever you want, like attacker 1 and attacker 2. Like the phone can be in any location. If you have open internet, you can forward that relay through to another phone and have that relay inside of Bluetooth Low Energy area. So thinking compromised phones, thinking attackers working together, buying credentials off like something like Genesis or access to a car off Genesis, and here, open your phone on this app that opens the Bluetooth Low Energy. Now here, let me unlock that. Here's $500.
So the security of your car, is it the same level of the security of your phone?
Yeah, basically. And it's not restricted now with Bluetooth to a geographical location in which you have to be. It has the ability to relay through someone else's phone that has internet. That's crazy. A bad day.
It's crazy to think about the security implications of all of us having a smartphone. Like that, how huge that wasn't a shift in 2006 or 7 when the iPhone was released, right? When you went from not everyone having a smartphone to everyone having a smartphone, and what the shift in security was for that.
Well, you think about not only that, but most people I'll be honest, from a security standpoint, from a security practitioner, you're thinking about your phone from the vendor's ability to secure it. How many 0 days are there? What exploits are there? Are there zero-click, exploits? Are there rootkits? Can someone bypass the rootkit or the PIN? We're not really thinking about our level of diligence that we're putting into those smartphones for encryption, for PINs, for passwords, for biometrics. Black bag, and we have all of our banking and crypto on there.
But dude, the story where even if your iPhone is off, this relates back to firmware. We talked about Samil and like the lights and LEDs with firmware, right? If your phone is off, there's still power to that phone, enough to power some firmware to do location services and other operations. So like, even if you think you're safe, like we used to think we were safe if we turned our computers off. No one can hack a computer that's turned off unless they physically steal it or have physical access to it, right? Now with your iPhone, if it's off, there's still an attack vector for a remote attacker. To me, that was really astonishing. Like, it made me think, like, literally I was laying in bed somewhat late I'm old now, so late in the evening is like 11 or midnight, right? I'm laying there going like, my wife and I could turn off our phones, but they're still vulnerable. Like, do I need to get RFID bags or Faraday cages for our phones when we go to bed? Like, maybe
100% going to be a thing.
Right.
I think.
Right.
I think we're going to see just like the camera sliders, where you're covering it with some kind of physical access. Like, this was a new dynamic, and this isn't new. Like, this is just something that someone's looked into now, and the cat's out of the bag. Like, it's called low power mode on iPhone. Anything iPhone 15 and after, that hardware is all available. And from low power mode, you can do locate your iPhone. You can do tracking. The Bluetooth chip is integrated through the SM chip, which allows some other things, because the Bluetooth chip can execute code. And the Bluetooth chip drivers are not signed on any of the iPhone thing. That was kind of a small discrepancy that they didn't think about. So now from low power mode, the theoretical attack, there's a lot of academia here, and this is just kind of getting out of the bag, but the theoretical attack is being able to flash the firmware on the Bluetooth chip so that the driver can execute code pre-boot and or do things with the phone off, maybe turn on the microphone, things of that nature. So I think this is just the tip of the iceberg for this.
Even RFID shielding or a Faraday cage at night. So before you go to sleep, like I've seen these, the pandemic kind of highlighted these things where you put your phone in it and it's the blue light, UV light rather, that disinfects your phone. Like maybe someone makes a device, which I would totally buy, which wouldn't protect you in the scenario you just described, Tyler, right? Every night, it charges my phone. There's UV light that disinfects it, and it's a Faraday cage, so it can't talk to anything in any kind of wireless communication. So 4G, wireless, Bluetooth, none of that's in play. However, I wake up in the morning, and I take my phone out of that thing, and then all these attacks you just described are totally valid. So it does help in the fact my phone's charged. Great. Now, just attackers have a fully charged phone to work with, and it's like clean, so I don't, get COVID. Although, whatever science is with COVID on your phone, right? But it's clean because your phone is dirty. I mean, your phone is dirty. Let's you think about you're handing your phone to other people, you're putting it down on things. Like your phone is dirty. I get that, so that's a benefit. But security-wise, it doesn't really help you in that scenario.
No, and this the real big caveat to this, and the thing that is now really making me reevaluate my phones is this is all integrated onto the chips. There's no way to remove this. This is a hardware function feature that is built in, and so the next generation of phones, even maybe the next two generations, because they're already past that for engineering and design to get out to the factory, for supply chain to get distribution out, is going to have this. And so we are not going to be able to combat this very well
Purism?
in the foreseeable future.
Purism is like $1,200 for a Linux phone. I was looking into that. Someone was communicating with me about, like, what do you run for a Linux laptop, or a laptop, Linux or otherwise? Do you do framework? Do you do Purism? Do you do System 76? Back to the firmware thing, right? Like System 76 has their own open source firmware. Purism does too. They can like replace all the firmware that runs on your laptop or your phone with their own open source firmware, so you know what you're running for firmware. You're not relying on any Intel firmware or other firmware on your phone. Is that where you go? But that's really like an esoteric thing. Like, who of us is going to run Purism on our phone? Like, what's the app market? How do you operate on a daily basis? I haven't looked into like what the user experience is, but I think from a firmware level, what we're talking about today, it starts to beg the question: do you go to an open source kind of phone that doesn't do this kind of stuff?
Well, is it going to be any better? Because some of those features, again, like then you're relying on that phone for their OS level security. If we know anything about iPhone, like Apple does a pretty good job of how they secure their phone. The enclaves, and so does Android. Honestly, like Google's had far fewer vulnerabilities over the last two kernel releases than even iPhone. So it's a hard sell. Like, I think we're going to be back to Blackberries at some point for some real paranoid people, because I don't know from a smartphone standpoint how you actually combat some of the newer features that are getting worked in. And consumers, at the end of the day, consumers don't care. They're not going to put their phones in a bag at at night. They want to get the call from their, teenager to go pick them up at 3 a.m. So
having a teenager, right? The technology decisions are driven by social norms. So
right.
That's the color of the text message that you get. So like if you don't have an iPhone, it doesn't show up as an iMessage, and therefore, oh, you're running a cheap Android phone, and that becomes a social norm. You could be shunned by your social circle for not having the right technology. Regardless of whether the security of that technology is not playing into that decision of your teenager, it's all about being like status quo of the social norm for your phone. To me, that's kind of scary. Really, my son's like, I can't run Android. He's like, my friends don't run Android, and I'd be shunned by my friends if I didn't have an iPhone. I'm like, that's super scary, right? Especially when we talk about privacy. I was talking to Dave Vitale earlier, and we didn't go fully down the privacy rat hole, but one of the things that was like a light bulb for me with privacy was my son and I get in the car on a specific day in the week at a specific time, and I look at Google Maps, and it's suggesting where we go and showing me the amount of time it takes me to get there and whether or not there is traffic. And I looked at my son and I said, that's super creepy because, on this day of the week at this time, I take you to wrestling. And Google knows where I'm taking you and is showing me the directions to that. And he's like, yeah, that's kind of creepy.
Yeah, so what happens when we don't, or if at some point, hopefully never happens, but what happens if we don't live in a democratic state or a state in which government is favorable, or even
like some other places in the world that are like, hey, you should be taking your son to wrestling at this time, and if you're not, that doesn't align with what the government wants you to do, and therefore you're penalized for that. I mean, you can take this to really extremes where the government is penalizing you for your interactions. Like if the government control, and this is a real, I heard this on some podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts, right? I heard this like if the government controls the currency, are you allocated currency based on your behaviors? Are your behaviors supporting the state in a communist country? And if they're not, does that impact your ability to make money from a financial perspective? Like, oh, we're going to hold back some money because you're not doing the things you're supposed to do. That's scary.
Or you get prosecuted maybe because you look guilty and maybe you're not, but you can't prove that you're not.
Right.
Like that is a thing.
Because you haven't opted in. You haven't opted into the tracking system from the insurance company. You haven't opted into the OBD2 connector that puts in your car that tracks how you're driving.
I mean, much of this is already happening. It is just our level of visibility into that, transparency, and the use cases right now. Like they're monopolizing it right now and utilizing it for things that, is useful to them, but we tend to not care about so much. But at some point that data may become more valuable to someone else, and the system may change. So
sorry,
it all is terrible.
Sorry, Lee, you were trying to pipe in there a couple of times, I feel like.
Well, it's okay. You guys are having a good conversation there.
Moment.
I was just thinking about Android, iPhone, irrespective, with the system on a chip. Basically, you've got a self-contained system for Bluetooth, wireless, and other components now that could be hacked independently of the OS, as Tyler was starting to say. And it doesn't matter which device you have. If you've got the hack for that particular system on a chip, you've got the hack for it. I seem to remember we've had several incidents of those kind of exploits being out there. And they were a little slow to fix because they're embedded. And it's up to the OEM to come up with a way to update the firmware, not the system on a chip person.
I agree. This is very much a topic near and dear to my heart. And I think the news that Intel, Lee, to your point, released 14 advisories covering 41 vulnerabilities, that many of which were firmware that's running, to your point, Lee, before the operating system.
Yep.
Right? So like we have this kind of matrix of vulnerabilities to address now. And I was talking about Dave Vitale earlier, right? You've got applications, you've got the operating system, you've got the kernel, and then you've got all the software and hardware that we call firmware that runs before that. And it's not just about securing any one of those things. You have to secure all those things.
And you're relying on the OTA updates too for things like phones. on your cell phone provider, and those can be pushed directly to your radio chip via the OEM provider. So, your networks, your Verizons, your Sprints, your T-Mobiles, all of those have the ability to push and flash. So we're relying on them to maintain security and the firmware that gets pushed down to everyone's phone on top of the hardware itself and the firmware that it's running.
Right. So the other thing is you're mentioning the RF bags, and I haven't checked them in a while, but a few years ago, there was areas where people were using RF bags to block, and you'd be sitting in a meeting with the people with their phones in the RF bags, and the phones in the bags would be ringing.
Yeah, so RF bags are not created equal.
Test it before you buy it.
Yep. Yeah, for sure, dude. I've seen that firsthand. Scary stuff.
Oh well.
What else do we have this week? Some good stories. Zixil firewalls.
Yeah.
Dude,
that's a gnarly one, man. That's bad.
I mean, this is like F5, like all over again. Like
have you seen the exploit for it? It's like one line of curl.
Pretty much.
Why Perl? It's always Perl.
No, I said curl.
No,
with a
curl.
C, not Perl.
Yeah.
With a P.
Curl. I was like,
no, it's
why
basically
would they Perl?
it's basically
I
like
was throwing curl under the bus, not Pearl this time.
Dude, it's an HTTP request, right? Unauthenticated.
Right.
Rapid7, you'll see this in the popular news, right? Rapid7 is the one that broke the research on it. Unauthenticated remote command injection. Like when you see that should just be like a.
Well, it was an instant. It was a 9.8 or 10 on some people's scales. Like that, it's as bad as it gets because it's VPNs, it's edge routers, it's things that are managing very sensitive networks remotely. Like this is the stuff that gets you access to a network. This is what nation states look for all day.
I really think that in this case and with F5, right, it's really two vulnerabilities. It's the ability to bypass authentication, and it's the ability to run a command. Like to me, those are almost like you made two mistakes in one that lead to really bad things happening.
Yeah. So the interesting thing here that I went to, and it was when in our last segment about firmware hacking is, right, there's not only a curl line HTTP GET that can exploit it, there's a Metasploit module. I'm like, I want a freaking emulator so I can play with this instead of trying to buy one of the vulnerable devices because that would rock.
No, agreed. Like, because acquiring the hardware is one thing, right? But a proving ground without the hardware gives you so much more flexibility. Like, to your point, that's where we need to be.
Yeah.
To get ahead of some of these problems, right? To run a honeypot or whatever to catch these as they're happening. It's really like a proving ground, right? Like, I feel like the F5 one was, I don't know where that one came from, or Zixil as well. I mean, Zixil came from Rapid7, right? But like the whole, like, where did it come from? Like, is it? I don't know that it matters. I think it's just kind of interesting to me to, like, did F5 release the patch and people reverse engineered it and gone, oh my God, that's heinous, right? Like, getting ahead of that. Getting your customers, not just the patch, but a workaround. Because the workaround in a lot of these cases is don't expose your management interface to the internet. I mean, that's like stuff we've talked about for 30, right, Lee? We go back 30 years to the inception of the internet. Like, don't expose that stuff to the internet is step one. We were talking about that earlier, about access to administrative interfaces in your devices. And I'm like, SSH works great. Like, you can have a fancy VPN and that's fine. But SSH works great for that too. Because if you have administrators that are at a deeper technical level, like SSH works great. And if you want to get a commercial version of that, you can go to SSH commercial, SSH.com, right? Is the person that developed SSH and get a great solution for that. So why do you ever need to have your administrative interface exposed to the internet?
You don't. And why do you need a non-encrypted protocol like Telnet anymore? I mean, 30 years ago, the devices didn't have any headroom to run SSH, but they do now. They can handle it.
Yep.
So I do remember I've talked to one network guy who was he had the routers and there was no at that time option for SSH. So what he did is he enabled console access only through the serial port, and he had a device that sat on the serial port that was basically an SSH interface to the serial port.
Oh, dude,
So
I had those at
that was pretty
the
slick.
university, right? That was our fail-safe. It was a physical device physically connected to the serial ports, which provided a TTY, right?
Yeah.
I forget what TTY stands for, terminal something.
Teletype,
right? And it was SSH to authenticate to that device. Once you were on that device, then you had a menu that I could serial terminal interface into that server and then provide a username and password. The flaw that I found with those kind of systems, Lee, is that if you left your terminal logged in, someone else could ride on that session, right? Like if I logged in as root over a TTY and I left that session hanging, if I connected to that system, this could be DRAC or any of those I forget what they call it, but the subsystems in the computers that allow terminal access. If I left that logged in, then I didn't need a password.
Right.
So a lot of it comes out of
configuration. Because you just reconnected to the session.
Right.
And you remember when we used to have a lot less reliable networks and they'd drop and you'd hope to get back in before the session timed out, and you could. And you would risky. I'd forgotten about that.
Not load balance, but you would do failover. Like you'd have your regular Ethernet production network, but then you have maybe a separate internet connection, a separate network that your terminal server was connected to that had access to those systems that could be built in or separate. Yeah.
Right.
Craziness. What's going on in Costa Rica? This one kind of scares me, dude. Like
they're still suffering down there, aren't they?
They're like literally fighting the Conti ransomware group. Like,
yeah, and Conti's playing pretty dirty too. Like they're pleading with the citizens, putting out some interesting messages. Talk to your government, overthrow your government, get them to realize all your data is going to be deleted. They're taking the political stance in a very, very low blow to basically stage a coup until they get paid. So they've got a lot of propaganda and backing to kind of instantiate something via the general constituents in order to make action happen and get them paid. Like it's an interesting tactic change.
Tyler, I heard that some people are like, oh, like it's Costa Rica, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, what? Like, who are you and why are you saying that? Like this is a country. Like whether this
is a U.S. territory.
Small, medium, large, doesn't matter. Like this is a country. They matter regardless. Like I don't care the size of the company, the country rather. Like they matter. Like why is that even a thing? Like why are you even talking like that? Like we should be helping. Now the U.S. we talked about last week had a reward for a few $1 million to whoever was doing this.
15?
Right? Yeah, 15 million. Like I feel like that's kind of it's kind of like that's politics, right? Like why aren't we helping Costa Rica? Like any country we should work together to protect. Like and
it's a government. Like we know that they're not funded all that well. It's just like any state or local government. It's a U.S. territory. For two, like we should be popping in here and doing some damage. And we know the actors. Like Conti, this is nothing new. We've been.
But it comes back to Rob Lee. Like he's like, I want to help the municipalities that are providing critical infrastructure services like power and water. I want to help them directly, like not just give bug bounties or rewards for you finally. Like I want to help them directly. I feel like that's what collectively, as even not just a nation, but globally, we should be doing with Costa Rica. Like what? Why are we letting them suffer? Like, let's go help them.
Someone wants their news time. Like this goes back to
it's a news churning cycle.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here trying to figure out what it is that's so important with the Costa Rica U.S. relationship. Where's the trying to follow the money? What's the win here for taking them out?
So
there's not. I mean, it's a target of opportunity. Conti's that way.
So and I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this, right? Like, this is a great line from the article. Conti ransomware, which is thought to be from Russia, has a $20 million demand.
Right.
Why would we give $20 million to Russia when we have this whole conflict going on with Ukraine?
We wouldn't.
And they're essentially the big bully picking on Ukraine. Like, I'm not going to mince words about that. Like, we can all agree on that. Why are we going to give them $20 million? Like, why aren't we going and helping in this situation? I don't get it.
Right. So I was thinking along the lines, okay, you've knocked out the government IT and government systems there. You could potentially put in your own systems and your own people. But what would be the win? What would be the value of that? I'm going down the spy versus spy side of the thinking here. I'm just thinking there must be some strategic advantage somewhere in there.
Conti is definitely
it's a small country.
Conti is definitely state-backed in certain aspects. Like, they have state affiliation, but they are their own group.
Right.
So
do they
I would say
is it like a mafia, Tyler, where they have to pay up? Like, if I'm a ransomware group, and this is just conjecture on my point, if there's a like ransomware group like Conti, there's like, I'm going after 20 million. I get that 20 million. Is it like the mafia where I have to pay up? Like, if you've listened to any, like, I follow mafia stuff. Like, there's a lot of us enamored with mafia culture, and you listen to Sammy the Bull has a great podcast, a lot of documentaries, and even movies, right? Like, if you're an associate or part of the Italian mafia as we've historically documented it, when you make money, you have to pay up in that organization. I make 10 million, I got to pay up 5 million. I'm just making up numbers, right? I got to pay up 5 million to the boss. Sammy the Bull has a great section of his podcast where he's talking about Paul Castellano and being in Paul Castellano's basement, and there being like more money than any human being could count in the basement. Like, and he made that money because people paid up. Is it a similar situation in Conti where they've got to pay up to the Russian government?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Like, the hierarchy, there are definitely people at the top inside of the government that intel gets shared up to, and access may be shared within if initial access is gained, or access.
But access money. To your point, Tyler, is also a form of paying up. If it's not money, maybe it's access or intel, or all money, access, or intel are all forms of paying up.
Yeah, that money is derived and funneled up through that for who knows what. At the top level, there are operations, and Conti is just like a business. Like, you get past a certain level and there's very little visibility, and they actually have decent OPSEC, but the money goes up that way. So there's only a limited amount of money going down into the associates, and the rest is divvied out the other way.
So there's also that if you're an affiliate using the ransomware service from Conti, I can't remember for certain, it was either 15 or 25% of the ransom goes to Conti. The rest you get, and they handle all the intervening technology. But also they actually have incentivized employment programs for people to develop their tools with rewards and all kinds of tiers for employment to get top developers in there. Well, they are a company. You're spot on. They are a for-profit entity that's making a lot of money.
No, it's a business, and they have. I mean, they recruit. They take in resumes. They have shell companies that they tell people they're doing, pen testing or bug bounty hunting. They have. I mean, with the Conti leaks, like when we popped several and leaked a lot of the chat servers that happened, and the stuff that came out of some of those servers between the tooling, the organization, the people, basically everybody in that org has, at a certain level been let go because they had to reorg because everybody was doxxed or they didn't know who to trust. There was.
Are you talking about is it the April threat report from Eclipsium I was reading that was talking about just that, right? Like, they were communicating going, we should really be communicating over secure channels, but they didn't.
OTR is a thing if it works.
They were leaked. Like, that's.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just one chat. Like, there's terabytes. All of a good portion of them have been identified. We've tracked them. They've been doxxed. We've made some connections to GRU or SVR, so there's a lot going on in the Conti realm. But it provided a lot of insight into how the business was run, how different organizations and departments worked, the money and pay structure, how the toolkit actually was developed and upgraded with Emotet, TrickBot, all of the botnets that they were leveraging for access and to pass stuff through. So there's a lot there. If you're interested,
it's old school mafia, dude. Like, there were the mafia essentially extorted money for protection, right? In this case, maybe it's not protection, but it's we won't prosecute you if you pay up. It's a very similar. I got a florist or a fruit stand, and no one messes with my business, but 25% or whatever the percentage is gets kicked up to the Italian mafia, and they provide me protection. I mean, that's like every mafia movie we've watched, right? It has that kind of model. It's not something we're trying to hide that never happened. Like, that shit happened, dude. Crazy. I love the mafia. Is it Paramount that has that new series that talks about how The Godfather was made? The producer for The Godfather, right? I haven't watched. It's on my list. I actually talk about marketing in business, right? Like, I subscribed to Paramount on a trial because I saw an ad. And what do they call the show? It's the show about the producer for The Godfather. Yeah. Like, talk about like a niche kind of, like, we're going to do a whole show, like, not about the Godfather movie necessarily or the actors, but the producer for The Godfather has a show and I'm like, I think that would be super interesting. And therefore I'm going to subscribe because I actually want to watch that. Like, that's really cool. Another thing that was really, did you guys see this weird story? Like, how often we don't normally talk about cardiologists here on the show? No. Like thankfully, I mean, if we have health issues and we need to go see a cardiologist, like, that's a thing. We don't normally talk about that in the context of cybersecurity. But apparently in Venezuela, there was a cardiologist that is responsible for ransomware. I'm like, I couldn't have really dreamt up that plot line for us to talk about on the show. I really couldn't have.
I mean, there's a lot of ransomware groups that are paying up to $1 million for initial access to run code in a privileged account. Like, they're buying sysadmin, network admin, DAs. You run this, here's $1 million. Like, it's and the internal threat through proxy, essentially. So that has been a thing for a while, but it is much more prevalent in high-profile networks. I wouldn't say a hospital is a super high-profile network, but maybe it didn't make $1 million either.
So this was the Thanos ransomware.
Yeah.
Which has a pretty cool name from Marvel, obviously, but Moses Luis Gonzalez, 55, created and distributed the Thanos software ransomware as a service, who also happened to be a cardiologist in Venezuela. In the U.S.
Did they say he created that?
That's what they say in the article. They say in the article, no, not created, distributed the Thanos ransomware as a service operation.
Okay.
Good delineation between those two things, right? But it's what I want to know from a legal perspective, right? The U.S. is basically going after this person, but they're in Venezuela, so there would have to be some kind of cooperation. And like, after I read the article, I was like, oh, yeah, like U.S. DOJ, like, said, and I quote, found several reviews for his products that touted their effectiveness. I'm like, all right, but it's the U.S. basically trying to prosecute and indict someone from Venezuela.
They'll write up indictment papers, and he'll be on a no travel list in extradition countries, and that's probably the extent of it.
Because Venezuela is not going to just give this person up, right? Like, that's a whole geopolitical conversation.
Yeah. So that interesting. I ran across an article of something. In fact, one of the ransomware gangs is hiring cold callers now to get people to pay up, which I thought was just crazy.
Dude, calling people works, right? Like, we've seen
it does.
Like, you get into someone's life. The thing that really fucking grinds my gears on this point is the pizza attacks, where Darknet Diaries has done a great job of chronicling these attacks, and you can read about them in other outlets, but Jack's done a great job of talking about, like, oh, you have a 3-letter Twitter handle or an English word that's an Instagram account, and therefore the attackers want that because it has value on markets where they can sell Instagram and Twitter accounts. So the financial incentive is, I'm going to go after you, and if I can't password spray or get your account, I'm going to COD deliver you pizza to you and your family, by the way, right? Like, I may be living in San Francisco and my family lives in Chicago, and we're talking, like, people are sending us these pizzas at like all times of the night consistently in the basically the ransom or extortion, excuse me, is I got to give up my Instagram account and I'm going to SWAT you. Now, swatting tends to get a different level of attention from law enforcement, but they're trying to fly under that law enforcement, kind of realm to accomplish that shit. Really grinds my gears. And what really, really set me off was in one of the accounts on Darknet Diaries, they tied it back to an IT security person that was doing these attacks. And I'm like, well, that's a member of our community that's doing these. Like, you're just being a horrible human being at that point doing these attacks. And that really pisses me off.
So, those VMware vulnerabilities from a week ago?
I haven't read about those, Lee.
I know there was something a week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, that there was vulnerabilities in VMware Workspace ONE Access, Identity Manager, the automation tool, their Cloud Foundation, and a couple other things. Apparently, the exploits are getting bad enough that DHS has put out an emergency directive to get it fixed, which tells me, irrespective of DHS's read, if you've got any of these products, get off your ass and patch them. Because
who patches the hypervisor, Lee? Like, no one patches, just like they don't patch the VCM or IPMI, IDRAC, ILO. Who patches their hypervisors?
Or our conversation with Rob, right? Like PLCs. You got shit that needs to be running. It's going to be 100% of the time for 15 years. You're going to do a firmware update? Like, oh, yeah, let's just throw a firmware update on those.
Yeah, right on. Get right on it. Right, I know. But like I said, if it's that bad, I mean, the interesting thing is the scope of this. Instead of just checking your on-prem stuff, they're saying not only check your stuff, but anybody you've contracted with to process your agency's data. That means cloud, outsource, all of it. So that means somebody's pulling a pretty big whistle here to get this moving. I just thought that part was rather interesting and alarming. Is it that bad? And I understand what you're saying about, update your hypervisor. Yeah, win. But is it that bad?
I think those ones were remote code execution and or local privilege or guest breakout. Maybe that was the one last month, but there was quite a few. And the prevalence of those being exposed to the internet or, one jump off of a VPN, say like a Zixtel VPN, makes for a pretty big target because there's a lot of people that have virtualized domain controllers, virtualized data stores that have sensitive information on it. So you pop the virtual hypervisor, gain access to that vSphere, the host. It becomes a pretty bad day because getting into those virtual machines becomes fairly trivial with essentially physical access or console access. Right. So yeah, they're being exploited heavily.
Did you guys see the story about the pen test firm that essentially conducted a supply chain attack against NPM as part of their pen test exercise? This is a lot.
Brazen.
A lot to unpack. So, like,
that's tricky. I mean,
because you got to get a permission slip, right, to test.
Right.
So, but like if I poison an NPM library, I don't know who might be getting that NPM library, and therefore, since I don't know who, I don't have permission. Like to me, that's a pretty simple thing to do, right? Like to think of, like, I can't do this, but the article
can't or won't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a risk appetite. 100% illegal, I'm sure, but
because you don't really have permission. I mean, if your code is executing on infrastructure that you don't have permission to test, that's a clear violation, right? Like I get what I see both sides. Like I get what they're like going after, right? That this is a problem, but we know this is a problem, right? So okay, you're gonna go prove the problem, but in proving the problem, you don't have permission to prove that problem at that scale. That's dicey, man.
you should not 100%. Let's be clear. We're saying you should not do this. This is not great. This goes against everything you learn when you come into this industry, but I don't think everybody follows the same rules.
No.
But I don't think the point needed to be proven, right? Like we know, especially with NPM, that this stuff happens. Like you don't need to prove that point, dude. Like attackers have already proven that point for you. When you go prove that point, like you're essentially a malicious actor at that point because you don't have permission. We've always said from the inception of this show that the difference between a hacker and a criminal is permission. And you got to follow that to the letter of the law. Like you got to have that. And if you're putting stuff out there like code that could be executed by anyone, you don't have permission to execute code on anyone's systems. Like you just don't. I think it was a failed experiment.
I feel like they crossed an integrity line there. It just there's a point where that's just a little too far off the edge of proving what can happen.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, like most of the time people won't fix stuff that they don't see exploited, right? Because they don't see the impact. And so like on that point, I see their side of it. Like if we don't poison this library or whatever, they're not going to fix it. And so like their intentions could be good, which I'm a huge fan of intent, especially when you get down to like, student hacks a school. And do you kick that student out of school and ruin their life and prosecute them and put them in jail or juvenile detention or whatever? But like, what was their intention, right? Their intention seemed good here. And again, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate. Like maybe they're trying to prove like this can be done, but our intention was not to violate the law or steal intellectual property or gain unauthorized access to systems we shouldn't be doing that for. I get that. But still, I don't know. It's a slippery slope. It really is. I mean, intent is a thing, but still, it's a slippery slope.
Permission is the first thing. Intent should be considered, but it still is like a bad teenager's decision.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, Tyler, you're right. Like permission does kind of trump intent in that realm too. And it depends on the scenario, right? Like you're a professional pen testing firm. Intent is, what that person, the intent is as a pen test company, where it's an individual intent is a different perspective.
You should be held to higher standards as a company, especially if you're doing it professionally. Like if that's what you're claiming, then you should not be going after the clout for exposing something like this if that's the intent. Or if you are, work with the vendor and find a scenario in which you do have authorization and permission to demonstrate this. Like that would have been a much better path to go.
Yeah, I think it's a harder communication and collaboration to like on the theoretical aspect. I get that,
especially with open source project.
Yeah, for sure. NSA the NSA came out with this list of weak security controls and practices routinely exploited. I didn't read this one in depth to see what those were. Do you guys find value in stuff like this? This begs the debate in my mind of, we've got a ton of stuff that we can find, enumerate, and find vulnerabilities in. What should we fix first? Like, it's a prioritization kind of thing. Should we just fix the stuff that attackers are exploiting? You should. How far do you go beyond that? Or if you focus on the stuff that's being actively exploited, does that get you most of the way there?
I think this one's valuable just because of how they released it and like what information they're gleaning in order to procure this list and kind of cultivate and make it within its priorities. Like, there's things in here, we should be doing, but if you need to prioritize, like, here's the information on why this is at the priority it is. This is the stuff getting actively exploited. This is the things being used in real time. And I think they've done a good job of making it very concise so that, maybe it's a small mom and pop, small business. Like, these are things that you can action on and gives you a good priority from the top down of where to start. So I find value in them when there's data backing them. That's when I see these kind of lists with kind of obscure opinionated values that are very, very high level. Like, these are very actionable, very specific information, the reason why they are where they are, and the specific controls that you need to do, as well as the exploits that are being leveraged in the real world for these. So I think it's kind of cool when they do these ones because of the data that they provide with it.
I mean, I don't think many of us would disagree with the list, right? Like, multi-factor authentication, incorrectly applied privileges or permissions, and errors with access control lists, software not up to date, vendors applied default configurations or default login and usernames and passwords. Like, you read this list and you're like, this is the shit we've been talking about for 20 plus years that people should do, right? The mitigations.
The mitigations were all good except for number one.
Dude, took the words right out of my mouth. That whole
Adopt
fucking
zero trust security model.
Fucking zero trust. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Really?
Bingo.
I love that one. The rest of them are good.
They're all great. There are some very great zero trust solutions out there. Like, I'll point back to Edgewise that got bought by Zscaler. Like, Peter came on the show, man, and he was like, look, this is what zero trust means. He had Python code that was running that was vulnerable and showed, like, here's how zero trust can help. And I'm like, dude, that's awesome. Like, it's really awesome. The problem is the phrase zero trust has been just thrown around like willy-nilly, like almost like fire, like, oh, you're insecure, you need a firewall. Like, oh, you're insecure, you need zero trust. Like, it's to those of us that are old, like magic pixie dust, right? Was that IBM's thing? Like, it's just like, oh, if I do zero trust, I won't get hacked. Like,
it's horrible. Like, they should make a shirt that just says zero trust, and then on the back it just says, but how? That's all it just says. That's not easy to do.
I think we got a new catchphrase. Trust me, do zero trust.
Right?
I don't know. I was a little torqued with the zero trust lead off because everything else was actually pretty cool. Understanding what the admin accounts can do, controlling access, do your MFA comprehensively, those sorts of things. They're really good. I don't know if they're trying to kick you off thinking, oh, here we go again by starting off with zero trust or something, so you don't just roll your eyes and tune out. But it's a good list of stuff. I'm not knocking it. I just kind of going, damn it, zero trust.
It's not really zero. I mean, you have to trust. You have to trust something, right? Like, trust is a model. It's not an absolute, and I think that's where the phrase kind of falls down. I don't want to knock people who are actually doing zero trust. Like, I gave the example, right? Like, there are great examples of that, but like, it's just a phrase that's kind of thrown around. Like, zero trust for me means, like, just, we were talking about the phone example. If I was zero trust, like, I'd turn my phone off, I'd put it in the Faraday cage, and I'd never turn it on. Like, that, in that scenario, like, I'm I don't trust anyone when I'm sleeping, was my example. But when I wake up in the morning, I take my phone out and I check Facebook or my email and Twitter and my text messages. Then I'm actually have to trust things. So it's not really zero trust. It's trust applied to all the different things that you interface with. It's someone asked me, like, what's your favorite word? And like in the context of cybersecurity, I chose the word trust in that example because I'm like, what we come down to is really trust in multiple facets. Like, you have to apply trust to the software you implement, to the solutions you implement for cybersecurity, to the messages you get, whether or not you trust those or not, how you train your users and employees of your organization to figure out what they trust and what they don't. Like, it does come down to trust. Zero trust is like this blanket term that, in that blanket sense, doesn't make sense to me, right?
Right.
If I had to pull it apart, that's how I would describe it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, their advice is the basics that we've talked about, right? If we had to define the basics, we wouldn't be too far off from their recommendations.
So, did you hear about the term cryware?
No, what is crime?
It's a new term from Microsoft trying to put it in the cybersecurity lexicon, basically to cover the people that have lost their crypto wallets. And no, I'm not targeting Tyler with this one. I just
not like lost is an overloaded term, similar to zero trust, right?
Yeah.
Lost is
Tyler.
Lost
is lost.
We always come back
Stolen
to poor Tyler that collected but like a significant amount of cryptocurrency and lost it.
Yeah.
Lost access to it, right, is another.
Lost access, stolen.
Yeah.
The result is the same. The result is I don't have that anymore, right?
I'm using
I'd
Yeti
like to go in the corner
mic
and cry for a little bit. But damn. I mean, it blows no matter what the situation is. Whatever the loss is, it still blows. And it's like, okay, there can be crying in cyber, but we still got to move on, pick up ourselves, and get fix things up. But yeah, I just thought it was cool. I thought it was interesting, and just see how far it goes.
Yeah, but I guess this is my thing with my hesitancy for cryptocurrency is the trust model. Like, OPSEC wise, how much effort you have to put into protecting cryptocurrency, because it's everything I've read recently, especially in the past year, how motivated attackers are to go after your cryptocurrency. Your level of OPSEC has to exceed that, and that level is pretty high, right, Tyler? Like the attacks that we've covered on the show, even, right? We haven't covered all of them. Like, the attackers are highly motivated, which it's scary, right? When we talk about how motivated an attacker is versus how much defense you put into your security model. Cryptocurrency aside, we've always talked about that kind of battle. I create a company, I'm going to put this much into my cybersecurity program and hope that that's enough to mitigate the motivations behind the attackers. When we talk about cryptocurrency, it's about currency. Currency is in the term. They want to make money. If they can just go steal the money, my OPSEC has to surpass those at all times. And that's hard when we talk about all the different cryptocurrencies, all the different wallets, and all the different implementations. That's hard, no?
That doesn't even take into account a lot of the other aspects that we'll probably cover inside of that webinar. But you start to bring into things like DeFi, Web 3.0, smart contracts on different exchanges and different blocks. I'm working on something right now where these attackers are super smart. They're leveraging bots in order to do upgrades on smart contracts that move to a different version that have a flaw where they can, cash out a staked portion of the cryptocurrency and take over that via a smart contract. So, like, in order to get this back, you can't just, move wallets or change passwords or anything like that. You're talking about smart contracts and bots that have to go and integrate themselves, and you're relying on timing attacks, the cooldown period that you have for that chain or the smart contract built into it, and some level of security around your diversification of those different smart contracts and wallets. So there's a lot to it that I just even understanding it, I don't think anybody's prepared for.
Yeah,
especially when
I read an article, Tyler, along those lines that Coinbase facing bankruptcy could take over people's wallets. Like that's right, because
they're custodial, so they have the key.
But there's a different. I don't follow the cryptocurrency stuff as much as you do, obviously, but like my wallet could live within Coinbase, or I can own my wallet, or I can diversify and have wallets that are owned by exchanges and wallets that are owned by me, correct?
That's custodial versus non-custodial. That's the difference between something like MetaMask, which is an app on your phone that is non-custodial. You manage the private and public keys. You're responsible for the security of that, versus something like Coinbase is both. They have a Coinbase wallet, but Coinbase itself is an exchange that is custodial. Something like Kraken. Kraken is custodial. They own the keys and they divvy out your private keys for a subset of that, but you don't own the keys. So they have access to your crypto on the exchange and can take it over. That's why attackers that don't know tend to get their assets stolen, because they work on exchanges that are custodial. They can get a subpoena and take over those accounts. Good attackers are going to have cold wallets that can't be subpoenaed, that may end up blacklisted, and they have to actually flush them or clean them, and that's an entirely different problem.
So back to the Microsoft thing for a second. They give a list of mitigations for hot wallets, and I'm thinking what's missing here is that fundamental understanding that Tyler keeps reminding me of how crypto works, what's what. It's like crypto 101. That if you don't understand that, these other measures aren't going to work. I mean, if you don't understand about the difference with a custodial wallet, you could follow these things and still lose your crypto. I don't know. Is it time for more crypto 101, or am I just oblivious that it's out there and anybody can find it?
No, there needs to be crypto 101, 101.1, 101.12. Like, crypto is hard. Each block is a little different, and the deeper you go, it is like InfoSec. The deeper you get into crypto and DeFi and how it all works together between different exchanges and altcoins and all the different things, it gets deeper and deeper. Like, you will never know. So just the 101 stuff is hard to get a grasp on and build a really resilient risk profile, as well as adapt a security posture for that risk profile for what you're doing. Like, how much risk are you taking? Which wallets are you using? What's the convenience you need? How often are you trading? All of those things come into you almost need a security background to fully grasp and formulate a real good 101 strategy just to be in the market and handle yourself with a minimum amount of risk. And that doesn't include anything that you start to get into with investments and putting liens or loans against cryptocurrency and staking stuff. So that's an entire financial sector and discipline in and of itself, and the security of that no one's thinking about.
I wanted to one last story. An angry IT admin wipes employers' databases, gets 7 years in prison. The interesting part of this story was this was in China. This wasn't in the U.S. As far as I can tell, this was not a case that was prosecuted in the U.S. Which
I didn't notice
that. I mean, I don't understand how U.S. laws work at like a really in-depth level, right? Because people go to school for that. We call them attorneys and lawyers. But then, like, every country has their own set of laws. So I'm like, that's kind of interesting that across country, borders, that these laws still apply. And I was like, what are the nuances? I didn't pick that up from the article. Like, what are the nuances between different countries' laws and being able to prosecute an angry IT admin that wipes systems, and how long they go to prison for, what their sentence is, what the evidence needs to be, and all that stuff. I think we've reached a point in history where if you do this, we've seen this in U.S. cases that I can talk more intelligently about. Like, people are getting prosecuted for this. This is like not a thing that flies under the radar anymore. If you're a disgruntled employee, you leave, you wipe systems out, you go into prison. In most cases, it's an easily prosecutable thing. This one happens to be in China, which is, I don't know how I don't know how this would play out in the U.S. If it would be a similar thing or not.
I would hope not, because I mean, yeah, that's pretty bad and that's monetary loss, but we have child predators that get off on less than that. So like these high-tech computer crimes that get these max penalties, like I get, but I also I'm not weighing out the two crimes as equal punishment and judgment. So
no, I agree.
Until those equal out, I am not a fan of that.
Yeah, I think across country borders, right? Like, individuals have been prosecuted and served less time for wiping out systems and things like that. Then 7 years is a long time, potentially, for this kind of case in China, right?
I mean, I'm kind of finding the bit about, I told you had security weaknesses multiple times and you didn't implement my program, so I'm getting even isn't something about that just seems really immature.
Yeah.
But maybe it lost something in translation, but I mean, I could see somebody getting pissed off because they're just not securing their stuff.
Sure. Yeah, it varies per country. Darknet Diaries did a chronicling of someone that did similar activities. I'm not sure how much time they served, right? But it was multiple mistakes. Like they did it once and they did it again, kind of thing. I think even served less time than 7 years, which doesn't surprise me. This happened in China. And they're like, oh, first offense, you wiped out systems, 7 years.
Yeah.
Whew. Even still, wiping out systems once you leave an employer will probably get you in legal trouble most of the time. Yeah. They're going to trace it back to you and probably get you in today's day and time. There's no leniency anymore because companies so heavily rely on that data, right? Easier to prove damages, I guess, is where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Knock out the payroll system for 30,000 people for what? A month? I think you get some damages right there.
Yeah, and that's that's kind of an interesting point. Like, you want to, maybe you're a disgruntled employee, you want to hurt the company, but like in the process, you've hurt the people that work for that company. And that's an interesting thing to weigh on a judge and a jury, that like, you didn't just hurt the company. Like, you're people that work there too. Like, that's not going to look good for you in court, certainly. Yeah,
stocks, dividends, companies, revenue, PR, things that are hard to monetize.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Oh, and I noticed this in my Linux updates. NVIDIA fixes 10 vulnerabilities in Windows GPU display drivers. This trickled down in Linux because I saw some security updates come down in the proprietary NVIDIA drivers for Linux as well. And some pretty heinous vulnerabilities in this one as well.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out from some of the lapses stuff I've been working on and have been worked prior, if some of this was from source code that was later discovered that was compromised, or is this different? We're still kind of digging through some of that.
I also found interesting, like, persisting in NVIDIA firmware is kind of interesting as well. I mean, it's basic. I mean, when you stuff a video card in your computer, you're stuffing a whole computer inside your computer at that point. I mean, there's RAM. So I'm trying to make the delineation between, like, software that runs on your existing CPU, right, versus software that runs on a CPU and RAM that's literally a computer inside your computer when you're talking about a video card. Some other firmware attacks are really you're running code on top of the CPU and RAM that's already in the system. I find there's a delineation between that. which is interesting.
There is, but there's also like we proved this a while ago. Like we've gotten code to run on a GPU, we've gotten C2 to run on a GPU. Like it has a processor, has memory, it has network stack that can interact. So it's a very dangerous computer in a computer that when attackers begin to learn how to leverage some of those things, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, but when you look at like the firmware on top of that lives in a hard drive or your PCIe bus or whatever, they're executing instructions on the CPU that's on the motherboard, not executing instructions on a separate, like the GPU is almost like a separate CPU that's running inside your computer. There's a delineation there for me.
Except it's got bus level access to the computer. I mean, it's got an intimate relationship with the CPU.
Yep.
You own the hardware it's sitting in. And you have a lot of horsepower. You could probably overpower whatever's running on the main processors and take over.
But there's also like
maybe a little bit of a stretch, but
yeah, but no, the delineation between firmware and microcontroller code, right? Like it's all very complicated and confusing. Like where is the code running? What constitutes a computer, right? Like if you're able to compromise the microcontroller on a peripheral inside your computer, is that different from code that's executing on the CPU that's on the main board, different from a GPU that's inside your, like, what's the difference?
I think if it has the ability to run code and make network communications, at that point it is a risk, and that is something you have to evaluate. Like a BCM to me is the ultimate in C2 communication and persistence. So like whether it's a computer fully or not, it provides all the things that I need as an attacker.
Crazy to think about.
Yeah. All righty.
Good stuff, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Over and out.